Welcome to our third Tuesday night in April around IEPs and mental health. Tonight, I'm very excited to have Susan Etscheidt here, and she is going to do school-based mental health services. And then she's going to join us again next Tuesday. So I hope you can come back for behavior support and student mental health. And again, this is such an important topic, and we're going to continue to explore it this fall with both she and Nikki through Ask Resource as we move forward so that we continue to grow and learn together. And I'm going to turn it over to Susan because I want her to use the whole time. So thank you, Susan, for joining us tonight, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Deb, and welcome, everyone. Let me go ahead and first take just a couple minutes to situate myself in this work, this whole approach to school-based mental health services. I have worked kind of as a special education law and policy scholar for a long time, and my teaching, my research, my service, again, has been very profoundly influenced by my 30 years as an administrative law judge. In that role, I presided over due process hearings that are available under the IDEA. So I was able to witness the law in practice and really kind of take a very close look at how the law impacted families and children with disabilities and teachers and administrators and schools. And so that front row seat got me very interested in what Kahn calls the cultural study of law. And it's really kind of a theoretical framework for legal inquiry that really is about the lived experiences of those involved in the law, and not so much about legal history or legal doctrine or legal theory or principles. So again, it's a real kind of phenomenological way to establish legal meaning. So my scholarship has involved analysis of the IDEA case law. I've loved every second of it. So I take a look at decisions from the Supreme Court and the appellate courts and district courts. But I also include these local due process hearings as part of my legal analyses. And a lot of other legal scholars have questioned the inclusion of these due process hearings as part of this scholarship, in that they don't have precedential value, or they don't have controlling authority in terms of legal terms. And yet I argue that's where we want to be. We want to see what issues are bubbling up at that local level. I think those local challenges or disputes, if you will, kind of illuminate some of the inequality in terms of educational opportunity, some of the problems of practice. So that's why this work is really exciting. I took a careful look legally at how we could possibly secure school-based mental health services for children with disabilities and their families. And I proposed that we have two avenues. One is through related services, and the other is through specially designed instruction. I think Nikki shared with you my slide that showed the 3 slices of a free and appropriate public education, which involved related services, specially designed instruction, and supplementary aids and services. So we published a manuscript that kind of talks about an approach to assessment, but now we're working on an even more exciting piece. And this is, you're the first viewers of this tonight. And that is this 6-step approach to securing these services in an IEP. So my plans tonight would be to take a look at some, I think, fundamental information. There's a lot of case law. I'm just highlighting a few cases tonight. We can go back as time permits, but I do want to afford you an opportunity to ask some questions about the content tonight and make sure that this information is of use to you and helpful as you, again, move forward to secure these services. So let me go ahead and share my slide. Thumbs up if you can see my slide, not my entire file deck, but just the slide itself, I hope. So this is our topic for this evening. As Deb suggested, I think I'll kind of go through with my information. Please, in chat to the steps, go ahead and jot down any questions or comments that you might have. And then we will kind of structure some time at the end for questions and comments. So I'll kind of go through each of the steps tonight and see there, try to in some way take a look at how this study of case law that I just talked to you about really informed this approach. That's why we got very excited about that. And so the first step, as you can see there, is we've got to figure out how the need for these sorts of supports must be established. So that's step one. Well, how do we do that? And following each of the sections here, I have presented some questions that I'm going to encourage parents to ask as members of IEP teams. So we'll do that for that first step. The second step is going to say that the PLAAFP, and those of you that live and breathe this world, know that that means the present level of academic achievement and functional performance must include the evaluation data, and we'll kind of share how that can be done. Third step is that the annual goals must be developed. And this is a very unique look at what are mental health goals for students. How can they be constructed in the IEP? And then the next two pieces, we've again spent a lot of time addressing what will SDI, what will specially designed instruction look like for a student for whom we are addressing mental health needs and supports. And that's different. What will these related services interventions, or what we call RSI, that's our own new acronym, by the way, carefully develop how those might be described. And then finally, once that IEP is constructed and memorialized, we want to make sure that it includes progress monitoring plans, and those have been carefully developed and implemented. So let's go ahead with this first step. And again, that's the importance of establishing the need for these services. What I want to introduce you to, or possibly reintroduce yourselves to, and would be what we call the RIOT data sources. These are very familiar to most members of the school psychology and RIOT teams, and also to special education teachers in terms of the types of data that can be used as part of an evaluation of student need. So the first R in RIOT is for review. And here we encourage a past or present review of the student's records. Now I've listed several here, I won't highlight all of them, but it could be behavioral rating systems. It might be attendance records. Most likely it will include student work samples, maybe correspondence between home and school, and then the progress monitoring data that have been gathered for academic and behavioral goals. And then any data from independent educational evaluations, there's yet another acronym, IEE, must also be included. So that'd be the review source. The I in RIOT stands for interviews, and this might be an interview of the student, of the parents, the teachers, related service staff, and others you can see familiar with the student. And typically, as you read this literature, those are going to be semi-structured and typically conducted by qualified personnel who have been trained in interview data collection, such as school psychologists, school social workers, or school-based mental health consultants. So that's the R, that's the I, the O would be observation. And again, this would be direct observation of student behavior, but not just academically. Also, what we're going to describe in just a few minutes is social emotional behavior as well. Okay, so again, we may take a look at inappropriate or problematic behavior that may be symptomatic of a student's need for these supports. Lots of tools. I teach about them in my classes as well. First, depending upon if we want to measure the amount of time or a certain number of events, but that's the observation source, mental health supports. And then the T in RIOT stands for test. And I think Nikki shared with you, and again, from our first manuscript, a relatively new assessment that we developed to establish the need for student mental health supports. So I'd like to share just a very brief look at the case law. And again, I've been kind of selective tonight since we just have a short period of time. But let's take a look at a few of the cases that relate to this first component of the evaluation data establishing the need. This first case, as you can see, is a due process hearing. So you're going to hear my reliance on those. But this is a 13-year-old student with, and again, my apologies for my world of acronyms, but please let me know if there are any that need further explanation. But this is a 13-year-old student with specific learning disabilities, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and anxiety. The school district, SD, knew of the student's anxiety, its increasing anxiety. The student was missing and failing classes, a lot of observations of crying. That independent educational evaluation described peer eligibility under the category of emotional disturbance and recommended school-based mental health services. The school psychologist's own assessment noted that the student had difficulty with peer and adult relationships, poor judgment, anxiety, difficulty with self-control. Teachers reported a lot of tearful breakdowns, and the school psychologist, again, recognized the student's need for support. But the school district kind of put off the changes. And after the student did have a panic attack and was hospitalized, the school district finally identified the student as eligible and provided counseling with a school social worker. But as you'll see, the administrative law judge said that was too little too late, and that the school district failed to heed those warnings from the independent evaluation and failed to offer these related services in counseling and mental health, including family and parent therapy and individual child therapy. Since the parent had pulled the child and placed the child in a private school, the parents were also reimbursed for that placement for the sum you see on the slide, $45,000. Just a second quick case that I really want you just to look at the final row here. You can look over the details, particularly once you have the PDF. But the school district said, student, as you can see, we have no obligation to conduct a mental health assessment without a direct request from the parent. And what I wanted to emphasize for you tonight is, as it says, the school district has an affirmative duty to assess the student in all areas of suspected disability, and that a parent request is not the trigger. Okay, so again, the school district, if you will, owns that responsibility. Let me move on, and you can take a look at the remainder of these cases on your own. But here are some questions that I would propose parents might want to consider asking regarding this first step. The interview, do school records show any signs of, and again, we just insert the student's name, mental health needs? What do the students' progress monitoring data show? Would someone be able to interview me about my concerns before the IEP meeting? Have observations of the student been done? What did they show? And have screening or evaluations for mental health been completed? And again, you'll take a look at these and decide whether or not they may be appropriate inquiries for your child or a child for whom you're working if you're a teacher in our audience tonight. The second step, second component is now we need to take those evaluation data and memorialize them in the PLAAFP. This is kind of the impact statement. It's showing how the child's educational performance is adversely affected. That's what our law requires, both at the federal and the state level. So again, this PLAAFP is going to describe the student's needs, I like that word impact again, states the impact of the student's disability on performance. Again, serves to document the student's current level and eventually serve as baseline data to measure subsequent progress. And again, it should help inform what we develop as goals and the services that we identify. Now, again, this is a lot, and I'm going to invite you to look over several questions, but this is what was so great, I thought, about this work, is it was so practical. It was so pragmatic. Academic focus said, here are some questions that the team should be asking about the child's academic performance. And then we gave samples of how those statements might look in IEPs. And so again, you can kind of see the academic focus here, but look at the next focus here on what we described in the PL-AAFP as the functional questions. I am going to take some time here. What are the students' strengths in the social, emotional, or behavioral domains? What adaptive skills are strengths? And you can see those listed. And then we take a look at needs as well. That's what was so exciting about this work. We were just very fully intent on providing very practical suggestions. And that's why we were delighted, as I told Deb, that this came through Ask Resource. Again, just a brief look at the case law here. I'll just highlight a few. This first one, a student with autism. The parent argued that discontinuing the student's self-management plan denied that student a free, appropriate public education. And the school district was saying, we really don't have a responsibility to address the student's anxiety because it really didn't affect learning. And we're providing accommodations, we're providing modifications and self-management instruction. But again, the evaluations revealed that the students did have anxious behavior, but the school district decision was convinced that, again, it wasn't to the point of incapacitating the students, despite the fact that clinically significant anxiety was present. Well, again, you can see how the court decided, this is a district court decision, decided that by the present levels, the annual goals, short-term objectives all showed the need for these mental health supports. And the failure to address the student's anxiety denied faith. School district's going to be ordered to consider all evaluation data and develop the IEP to address anxiety. Again, you can look through the other cases on your own. I think they're all very interesting, but that's kind of the world that in which I live. So what might be some questions that parents would want to ask about this component? Well, what are John's academic strengths? What are the areas of growth, interaction, possibly what academic areas are more difficult for the student? Because again, those academic strengths and challenges may be indicative of the need for mental health supports. How about the student's social skills, interaction with peers? What about communication? Any behavioral concerns? What about the student's emotional strengths or need? Any concerns about emotional regulation, anger, anxiety? So this is, none of these are an all-inclusive list, but just a sampling of questions that parents might want to consider asking as members of IEP teams. We also wanted to roll up our sleeves and take a look at, well, how will these goals look for the performance areas that have been adversely impacted by the students and mental health needs? And just some general guidelines. The team have to examine the data presented in the PLAF to guide the development of goals. We usually look for one goal for each area of identified need. And I know I'm, again, kind of preaching to the choir here. The essential components of those goals, specific description of the skill, how it will be measured, and the criterion for progress monitoring. So they can target both academic and social emotional goals as well. I think you'll enjoy seeing these as we bring these up tonight. Focus, this one that so I'll let you take a look at what's an awful lot of information on one slide, but we really took a look at an academic focus and what would a goal look like there. What about a functional focus? This one that we selected was a peer interaction. But then what I really wanted to highlight, let's say we're looking at a mental health goal that's addressing a student's anxiety. Alternative approach, not only do we have a goal to decrease in this situation what's described as panic episodes, but also a goal to improve and increase alternative appropriate behavior. We did the same thing for the behavior goal of anger. So again, I'm just giving you some samples as we go through this tonight, given our time, and I'll be happy to answer some questions. Let's take a quick look at the case law here before we get to the questions parents might want to ask. Here's a 16-year-old student with the federal description of emotional disturbance, and prior evaluations indicated the student had depressive episodes, poor social interaction and adaptability, lack of emotional control, and the student was frequently absent and had some very low grades. The IEP provided for a guidance counselor for social skill trainings, but there were no goals and there was no specially designed instruction for addressing the student's emotional needs. So again, those efforts were again too late, and social skill training was not sufficient. Look at that next comment. The student required individualized emotional support services on a regular basis, rather than sporadic opportunities for social skill instruction. So again, the parent was granted compensatory education, and that represents a making up for lost time for failure to have appropriate supports. You can look through the other cases on your own. Again, I think they're very interesting information, but we're just sampling a few tonight. So what about questions in this area, this goal area that parents may want to ask as members of IEP teams? And by the way, towards the end, you're going to hear me with a very strong suggestion that these questions be forwarded in advance of the IEP meeting, not the day of. So provide these to members of the IEP team as an intended focus for the meeting. So what about should IEP team members, John, have a behavioral goal, a social skill goal, a communication goal, a self-monitoring or self-regulation goal? So these are good questions. And if they are, again, forwarded to the other IEP team members in advance of the meeting, they can be thinking about their responses to these questions. So this preparation, a step in the right direction. Well, this one I think was the most challenging component for us because it required us to really roll up our sleeves and take a very hard look at what SDI looks like and what related service intervention might look like for a student with mental health needs. And as far as our reading suggests, we're the only one that has attempted this piece, completion of the research. So let me have you take a quick look at, again, another slide that has way too much information on it. But what I wanted you to see is here's these same goals, okay, the assignment completion, the positive interaction, the panic episodes, the anger. So we've looked at those, we've looked at the goals, but now take a look at those last two columns. The specially designed instruction is going to come from the special education teacher. And you can see just again, kind of a variety here. The student's organizational skills through the use of a planner, for example, or an app. Time management, for example, the use of a visual schedule, or what we call assignment layering, which is again, breaking one thing that you're going to expectations into small units. Then in the next one, we've got the special ed teacher providing that social skill instruction using modeling and behavioral rehearsal. One thing that you're going to hear next week from us when we're talking about behavior intervention plans is the need to be very specific about the strategies and the interventions used. The case law there is just amazing. You'll enjoy seeing that. In the next one, you've got the special ed teacher working with the student to develop self-monitoring and self-breaking strategies. And then across from those, here's what we call the related service intervention. And the top one, the school psychologist meeting with the student to provide executive functioning instruction and emotional regulation. students week, possibly a school social worker in the next one, working with students to teach them cognitive behavioral strategies to address anxiety. The panic episodes that you see, maybe the school psych, working with the students weekly for 30 minutes to provide exposure therapy. Nikki, I think, talked about that with you, or strategies for reducing anxiety. And the last one, the school counselor, working with the student weekly to teach problem solving, relaxation, and mindfulness. Students with ADD or ADHD will access. So a quick look at the case law here. This one, again, a high school student with other health impairments. And so typically that's where students with ADD or ADHD will access services under federal and state. That was good law. So this one was very interesting because the school district said counseling is really not offered as an IEP service. It's just made available to all students. And anytime the student wanted to set up an appointment, that was going to be fine. But again, as the case unfolded, the counselor had canceled many of the sessions that the student requested. So again, there was a letter to the parents saying that, yeah, the student's permitted to use the bathroom, get drinks when needed, access staff to de-escalate, counseling if the student would like that once or twice a week, but the IEP had no counseling in it. So again, this idea that it's just available to this administrative law judge was troubling. And again, as you can see, the ruling, if the student needs counseling, it has to be in the IEP. Otherwise, that's a violation of a free, appropriate public education. Again, I'm going to encourage you to take a look at some of the other cases. I just find them all very intriguing in terms of some of the difficulties that had been bubbling up and how the administrative law judge or a district court judge or a circuit court judge responded. So what about questions in this area that parents might want to consider asking? All right, let's think about those. Could you describe this SDI that John receives? And this is, I think, very important. John needs counseling. Give me some specific examples of that instruction and how does John respond? And this one's rather direct, but without asking, we don't have a response. Do you think John needs counseling as a related service? Because now we've been through the evaluation, we've been through the PLAF, we've been through the goals. And now we're taking a look at the services provided. All right. And I would stop here for just a second to have you focus on that word needs. Because the question isn't, wouldn't it be nice for the student to have counseling or relaxation, not interventions. It's a little more urgent than that. Must the student have these services in order to secure a free and appropriate public education? So it's just not an add-on, if you will. It's not something that would be of benefit to the student. It's urgent, the student. So again, what we're asking is, do you think the student must have counseling in order to receive a beneficial educational program? Now, this next question is the topic of our entire week, next week. How does my student need a behavior intervention plan? And when we're done next week, and I'll introduce you to a colleague of mine, Whitney Hanley, who will join us. Her whole area of research and focus on positive behavioral supports. She's going to show often one aspect of her research that deals with a relaxation and change of location strategy that has been highly, highly effective. So let's ask about the behavior intervention plan. And then we oftentimes encourage parents to ask questions about assistive technology or communication supports that might help achieve these goals. So again, the assistive technology isn't the goal. The assistive technology, or AAC, is the support to accomplish the goal. So these, again, are not intended to be all-inclusive, but possible questions that we would ask. And again, I will emphasize in advance of an IEP team meeting. All right, let's go ahead then to the service last component, which is that progress monitoring plans must be specified. And then I'm adding, as you can see, they need to be implemented with fidelity. So again, it's one thing to have these services and supports identified on an IEP. It's quite another to have them implemented as intended. As you can see, the typical way, either or an awful lot of the goals will be through what we describe as kind of systematic direct observation. And again, sometimes paper pencil type of recordings of interval or time sampling, either a trained observer or we prepare our teachers to take these types of behavioral data, perhaps multiple times during the day or week. It really does depend on the goal. But again, the focus is going to be that target behavior of the goal, which is oftentimes an alternative appropriate behavior. But it will be, the target will be the behavior disorder selected by the IEP team. Let's take a look at some, I think, interesting case law here. And so the first unilaterally in row suggests that this is a teenager with oppositional defiant disorder. And the parent is, we've been claiming that the school district failed to provide needed counseling. And so the parent unilaterally enrolled the student in a private school. I like this one because it shows each of the components that we've been talking about and how they, again, contribute to an overall understanding of the student's needs and supports that should have been provided. So first, we have the present level of academic achievement and functional performance. And as you can see for this teenager, the needs were included, the student's performance levels were included, data regarding the peer relationships were included, the observations of the oppositional behavior. Again, that's the target of the need area, and also the anger manifestations. And I like this next one. This is what we, again, aspire to have. The goals were very clear and reflective of the student's needs and performance levels. Okay, so again, the student, this is what we're hoping for. The goals involved the student demonstrating the self-regulation or the student seeking support, adult as a support, sometimes depending upon the individual student, perhaps peer support, and alternative ways to express anger. That's just great goal construction. And imagine this as a complement to the academic goals that the students have. Well, now let's take a look at how the specially designed instruction was determined and memorialized. Both group counseling once a week and individual counseling twice a week for, and look at the matchup here with the goals, impulse control, social skill development, and anger management. And finally, the progress monitoring had objectives that included very detailed criteria to monitor the student's progress. So if you're wondering, that looks terrific, what went wrong? We'll take a look at that last row, excuse me. This is going to be held for the parent. The school district failed to provide the counseling that was memorialized in the IEP and therefore denied the student FAPE. The student needed that regular therapeutic intervention and weekly counseling. But I like this slide because it really shows how each of the components that we've talked about, I like this is memorialized in an IEP addressing a student's need for mental health supports. You can again take a look at some of the other cases that are identified here. I like this one as well. I won't go over it in as much detail, but here again, social emotion, 13-year-old student with kind of a learning conduct disorder and other health impairments. School district failed to implement the IEP and provide counseling. And as a result, the student's social emotional problems increased and obviously impacted learning. So let's take again, studies, I'll look at how these read in terms of the PLAFP, needed supports, and SDI, Goals, you can see those listed. The SDI, 30 minutes per week for behavior, study skills, counseling. But again, because you know what component we're in, and this is progress monitoring, the school district failed to provide these services. Again, compensatory education's ordered, which involved 14 hours of specific counseling. So let me see where we are. Let me stop sharing my screen here. We can go back and take a look at any of the questions that were on any of the slides. We can also take a look at some of the cases that I didn't describe or present, but I thought it might be most beneficial to reserve a little bit of time for your question and answers.
So thanks, Susan. Really appreciate, and I've caught nuggets. I have to give my editorial about sending information ahead of time to families. I'm such a believer in that the professional side and the family side should have the same questions. I think that's so powerful. On our Ask resource site, we did create a document for IEPs. I'm kind of editorializing here, but because this fall it was so tricky, right, with COVID. And so we created one side was for families, and then we just reworded the questions for the educators. So I just think the more we can all do that, the more we become bi-directional in the work we're doing. So I just want to put a plug in to the professionals out there to start thinking about your thinking around that, because I think it's a powerful way to make that bi-directional, build those relationships. We've got a couple of questions. Is there helpful criteria to measure and determine, and I have need in quotes, for counseling services from questions for parents to ask?
Right. And I think if we return to those RIOT sources, one thing we've been concerned about is those seem to be oftentimes the domain of the, for example, school psychologists, and I think Nikki would agree with me on this, and not encouraged as data inquiry points for parents. So I think we do want to, in our questions, as we develop these ahead of the IEP meeting, really ask about records and really ask about observations and ask about interviews, and not, again, that were done after the parent request, but hopefully done before that time, and then any assessments as well. What's tricky a little bit about the criteria part of the question is that it's so unique to the individual child's needs. And one thing that Nikki may have talked with you about is the difference between what she could have described as externalizing behaviors and internalizing behaviors. And based on those manifestations, we might be using very different tools to assess a child's needs. But if I could maybe just underline and highlight one critically important phrase for you tonight, is what we're really after in this behavior and evaluation data collection is the adverse impact on the child's educational performance. As we've known from a lot of case law before this, disability alone won't establish the need for services. It is this adverse effect on educational performance. So how is it affecting academics? How is it affecting social and peer interaction? It might be affecting assignment completion, but it also might be manifesting itself in ways that are impacting the student's social and emotional functioning. So how are the student mental health needs impacting and adversely affecting educational performance? That should be on everybody's radar. Again, we want to make sure that as we're taking a look at student needs, and the law, both the federal law and the state law, requires that we assess the child in all areas of suspected disability. And I'm hoping Nikki highlighted this as well last week. That's going to include social, emotional, and behavioral functioning.
All right, we have more questions, and they all want to kidnap you to their school, just so you know. I was thinking it was me and they wanted me, but I think it's you. So this is from Tracy. It seems like schools tend to focus on math, reading, etc., rather than mental health. How would a parent go about requesting the mental health issues? They have told me it looks like he's receiving therapy outside of school. Does school have an obligation to provide additional mental health services?
And that's going to go back to the highlight I made earlier. The question is, wouldn't it be nice, or wouldn't the student benefit? Must these, it's a little more urgent than that, must these services be provided in order to secure the benefits of a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE? That's the threshold that has to be established. And if, again, the evaluation data, I agree with your comment in terms of the focus, oftentimes more academic, but I realized everyone here tonight is also aware of this increasing trajectory of need. And we've been looking at this expansive need before COVID. We're only looking at that being intensified post-COVID. And so the one maybe silver lining I could provide is, I'm so happy I'm here tonight with you. We are sharing this information. I teach a special ed law class every Wednesday night. I'm sharing this information with prospective administrators in terms of their affirmative duties under federal and state law. We're training our special education teachers here at UNI to recognize this need. Nikki's training the school psychologists to recognize this need. Although we're moving, I described this to Deb the other day. These seem like baby steps. It seems so enormous right now. The need is so enormous, and we just can't get to this fast enough. So we've been working and trying to address the students' academic needs and make sure that the programs that we've developed and memorialized are providing academic benefit. But I just returned from AERA, that's a national research convention, and our presentation last week was really about focusing not just on academic benefit. And we looked at decisions from the appellate courts and the circuit courts and the district courts. We said there are other benefits, for example, to inclusive placements other than academic benefit. Our topic was LRE, and I know that's not your question, but I just want to emphasize, I think that over-reliance on academic benefit perhaps gets in the way of expanding the child's IEP to address these other areas of need. I hope that in some way responded to your question.
Thank you, Susan. We've got more coming in. What guidance would you give to AEAs to move forward in preparing our staff in school to better support, instruct students that have SEBH needs, social, emotional, behavior, health needs? So
yep. I think this is a shared initiative. You heard, I think, from Nikki what we're doing at the pre-service level, and we are also doing this at the in-service level. Nikki and I have been to a lot of the AEAs. We are more than happy to provide this information, not just at this pre-service level. As I described, we're trying to prepare our Strat 1, our Strat 2, our early childhood, our secondary teachers to recognize this area of need. And they are. I mean, this, as you know, this whole social emotional learning area is just exploding. You've probably had wonderful presentations on that in and of itself. But we're also doing that at the in-service level. We're making sure that professional development opportunities are afforded to individuals, both in the LEAs, the local school districts, as well as the AEAs, again, with our school psychologists, the social workers. But I'm also convinced, and this is mostly because of decades of teaching my law class to administrators and prospective administrators, that's where this change has to begin, with the instructional leader, the visionary for the school, if you will, embracing this idea of responding to this need. I'm also aware of developments at our state level. Not only is there an acute awareness of this, there are initiatives to advance these opportunities to address social, emotional, and behavioral needs and provide school-based mental health supports. And it's some great work, but that's also critically vital is that state level leadership. So we've got lots of pockets of initiatives going on. Again, that's why we were so excited about having this opportunity from Ask. But again, we're looking at the AERA was an international conference. We provided information at both the state and regional conferences. I'm part of the Inclusion Conference that some of you might be participating in. It's also next week, along with our behavior intervention plan. So we're very dedicated to this work. We recognize the need, and it will take a lot, take a village to move this forward and to secure these services.
These are two that I'm wondering if next week you want to touch on. What do you do if the AEA/school won't recognize a professional full-scale IQ eval? And then the other one is, can you talk more about what assessment tools and resources should be considered in an educational setting, not clinical, to consider whether mental health needs are a concern and should be included in the IEP? And then I've got a longer one. How would you utilize the latest federal dollars for mental health supports for schools? So I'm wondering if we can touch on some of this next week, because I know we're going to run out of time, because I still want to get to this last question. Do you want to touch on any of that, or do you want to maybe circle back next week?
I do. First, on the last one, this has to be a coordinated effort regarding funding. This has to be a very responsive, perhaps creative ways to take, and this is part of the article that I mentioned that was just published in Exceptionality, and I think Nikki referenced that for you. We really are talking about a coordinated funding effort. This has to be multi-agency, this has to be multiple funding opportunities, but coordinated to meet the needs of all the kids. As I said, this is, oftentimes this is a question about which children can we afford, to provide these services. We don't want that to be the question. It's a matter of how we can find creative solutions to provide these school-based mental health services. And it's kind of interesting when we talk to the practicing school psychologists, this is the work they want to do. I don't know if Nikki mentioned this direct service provision. They've got so many other roles, and maybe many of you out there are AEA support personnel. But when we talk to them, they want these, what we call related services interventions. They want an opportunity to work directly with students with these support needs. And so I think that's very encouraging. So funding is a whole topic in and of itself. But again, what's essential in our view is some sort of creative coordination so that, again, this is a shared responsibility. Back to the assessment question, I think I would, rather than going to a specific technique, because that's kind of difficult without me knowing all the specifics, but I would take you back once again to a very, what we call it, there's breadth and depth to that RIOT assessment. And if we're looking comprehensively at each of those areas, we should be able to establish the child's need for these services. And I've got to go back once again. The question isn't, wouldn't it be nice? This is urgent. This is essential. We are looking at a direct and adverse effect on educational performance. And we need to consider either specially designed instruction or related service interventions, or a combination of both. That's why I think you'll find those columns. And I realize those are kind of hard to read this evening, and you'll have the PDF that you'll be able to review. But I think that's what we were excited about. The manuscript that we're authoring right now not only has this 6-step approach in it, because I think you'll appreciate this, it has 2 case examples, which are really great. And it's going to be hopefully published in Teaching Exceptional Children. But we have deliberately included a parent partnership piece and then a student involvement self-determination piece. We have different authors from across the nation helping us with this series that we're hoping that will be published next year. So again, it's a matter of getting the research out, kind of activating various partnerships, both at the state and someone mentioned the federal level, and how to best utilize the funding and the monies available. But it has to be a shared responsibility. And that also includes the involvement of all members of the IEP team. Right before your next question, I just want to make sure that I emphasize this sort of advocacy is also shared. You as parents are advocating for your individual children. these other professionals must advocate for these children and students as well. So when I talk about shared, I mean that in the truest sense of the word from all interested participants.
Well, we're getting close to the end, and so we may want to start with this question, and you actually touched on it with Riot. So I'm going to read it, and maybe that's where we'll begin next week, because then people will come back and have to hear the answer. And this is from Melissa. For my clarification, to ensure that I am interpreting your answer accurately to my need question, we need to make sure we are digging deeply enough using Riot data sources and cross-referencing for all the information to help identify when counseling goes from being a nice support to a need. I just want to emphasize that because I've seen too many times data gathered is only surface level or not expansive enough to help make educational decisions. Thank you.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And again, that's a hard threshold, if you will, because we would want this for all of our children. This would certainly be beneficial. But again, what we must address is the vitality of these vitality of the supports to individual children. So it does become a rather stark threshold, but it's the important one for securing these services.
And I think, Melissa, you shared the link to the article, I believe. So thank you so much for doing that.
Well, and as I mentioned, this is the first time that we've shared this 6-step approach. I mean, we kind of briefly described it to a school psychologist group. Some of you may have been in attendance there, but this is the first time that, step-by-step format in this much detail has been shared. So we welcome your feedback, your comments. We take a look at this, if you'll permit me, as social validity. We talked to parents, for example, and this is what they told us, that we're on track here, that these conclusions were correct, that these are some gaps that are existing now. So any feedback that you can provide us is also very much appreciated.
Well, Susan, thank you. Please come back next week. We have behavior support and student mental health. I would love to capture her every week. It was so awesome between she and Nikki. We have a question here, and maybe we start with this. What do you suggest that parents do as next steps if they have followed recommendations and there is an urgent need and the school still denies services? So maybe we can touch on that next week because we're at 7:30 and I have to honor our ASL interpreters and all of your time. So yes, and good point, Alicia. You can register on our website and then that way you'll get the updated information. That's how you actually will know. So Susan, I look forward to next week. Thank you again, our interpreters. I appreciate the hard work that they do and that they hang in there with us. And thanks everybody. See you next week for another episode with Susan.